For our next and final session here at Hall 2 is the Metabolic Health Reset. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome on stage Mr. Ricky Brown.
One, two, microphone check. Been sitting down for a while, guys. Do you want to stand up and stretch out? Do you want to do a little bit of twisting and turning, a little bit of squatting, bending the knees, getting the blood flowing a little bit, getting the oxygen to the brain? No? Okay, just take a few deep breaths where you are. How do I follow those two talks? How do I top that? I mean, fantastic. First of all, we had a deep drill down into the importance of muscle mass, which is just fundamental in today's world, where we wonder whether we're actually over fat or under muscled. Because we're not using our bodies as much as we really should be, as evolution has designed us for. And then we had zoomed out and we had this, brilliant kind of overview of the importance of the first line in treating non-communicable diseases, which is really lifestyle medicine. And so really, I can't top that. I should just go home now, right? But all I'm going to do is maybe talk a little bit on the application, because I believe that medicine is an art and a science. And the science part, yes, it's great. We've got the studies, we've got the data, but it's how do we apply that? And in a country where literacy is generally high, but health literacy is a little bit wanting. So being able to impart knowledge on our patients and then being able to then use that knowledge in a practical way that suits their lifestyle, I think is a challenge. And, doctors like Dr. Aisha, kind of getting people into the community, getting people exercising, getting people to be what I would say is active participants instead of just passive recipients. Because I think the conventional medical model is really designed for it's more of a paternalistic kind of, it's a consumerism where the patient comes in, they listen to the doctor, they take their meds and they go home. But really, we need more active participation. We need more patients actually being in a team with their healthcare practitioners, as opposed to just being blindly led and just being consumers of healthcare. They need to be participants within it. So the Metabolic Health Reset is really just it's a program that I designed 6 years ago to basically try to get out into the community and distill the science into practical information and practical interventions and activities that can help people actually really get to the root cause, to prevent and actually to resolve a lot of these non-communicable diseases. And a lot of the times we're addressing symptoms, we're addressing complex symptoms of these root causes of things such as insulin resistance, as we just heard, and metabolic dysfunction. So let's crack on. Now, my background is, I started in the military as a Royal Marine in the UK, and then I became a fitness instructor, became a personal trainer, and then I decided to go and study osteopathic medicine, which included naturopathic medicine as well. And as a personal trainer, one of my first roles was as a cardiac phase 3 rehab instructor. So that was helping people recover from things like MIs, myocardial infarctions, angina, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, and in some cases, for the lucky people, stroke rehabilitation. And one of the most common things that I heard amongst the people that I was working with, the patients I was working with, was that how much their lifestyle had changed in a short space of 20 years. And a lot of these people, they generally had good lifestyles. They had healthy lifestyles. They were mostly baby boomers, so late 50s, early 60s. But most of them also had metabolic dysfunction as well. And so it struck me, and I thought to myself, wow, if this is now 2001, and this is in central London, where I was working in a council-run gym, I was thinking, if this is now, what's it going to be like in 15, 20 years' time? If, just small changes in the environment, such as the fall of the high street, the artisan butchers and grocers giving way to these kind of satellite Tesco's and Sainsbury's, where most of the food is ultra-processed. The kind of collapse of community hubs where these more mature people would go out and they would be physically active and they would be in communities, but now they were staying at home more, so they weren't getting as much physical activity. And so there was this kind of environmental contribution to this kind of rise in metabolic dysfunction and then manifesting itself in cardiovascular disease. And so I thought to myself, wow, if this is now, again, what's it going to be like in 15, 20 years' time when I want to have children? You know, what's our environment going to be like? And, you know, kind of lo and behold, here we are, 2025. And this image really says 1,000 words. I don't know whether anybody is aware of Fred Flintstone, well, this is just really to reflect where we are in modern society. So we are hunter-gatherers. Physiologically, we are, you know, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. We are designed for environments of scarcity. We are designed to be living outside in natural light with our circadian rhythms, the 24-hour sleep-wake cycles. We're designed for environments where we are eating foods that are more for nourishment, not so much for entertainment and for pleasure, which I think is predominant in today's society, where we're eating just as much for entertainment as we are for actual nourishment. And so what we see here is this mismatch. We see Fred Flintstone, the hunter-gatherer, with his bucket of KFC in a modern environment. And if I'm to kind of be very maybe a bit provocative, I would say we're living as zoo humans, like zoo animals. You know, we are now mismatched with our environment because physiologically, the environments that we're living in are nudging us towards these kind of non-communicable diseases, whether it be type 2 diabetes, whether it be cardiovascular disease, whether it be various cancers as well. And it really is up to us to be aware of this and to acknowledge it firsthand, that for every single one of us in this room, we are challenged with an environment that is mismatched to our physiology and biology. And just as a kind of visual representation, if we were to put 300,000 years and condense it down to a 24-hour clock, we can see that, you know, for approximately, you know, since Homo sapiens have been around 300,000 years, we've spent 23 hours and 58 minutes living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you know, living more outdoors, living in environments of food scarcity, being physically active, living under natural light. And it's only in the last, say, 200 odd years of the Industrial Revolution, the agricultural societies have come along. The last 10,000 years since, you know, the Paleolithic era, and then 200 years, you know, the Industrial and Digital Age, which is literally like a second in this 24-hour clock. So you can see that for the, you know, lion's share of our evolution, we have adapted to certain environments. And there's an American geneticist called Theodosius Dobzhansky who said, you know, nothing can be understood in biology except in the light of evolution. And so what we have evolved to be as a biological entity is mismatched with our current environment. And I think it's really important that we should all acknowledge this context before we kind of like address our patients. And it's not just a professional thing, it's a personal thing. We're all faced with the nudges towards, you know, these environments and also these kind of stimuli that are in excess harmful for us. And we're not just living in an obesogenic environment, we're living in an addictogenic environment as well, because many of the things that we are faced with are designed to get our attention and make us loyal customers, whether it's our technology, whether it's the type of food we're eating, whether it's, you know, the stimulation through certain substances. And then you've got the CEO of Netflix telling us that the only competition they have is sleep. Because, you know, we are being constantly nudged towards these stimuli, which are, you know, kind of robbing us of our health. And, you know, when it comes to our food especially, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that food addiction is a real thing. And as the last speaker mentioned, you know, talking about controlling the food consumption, and also the types of foods that we're eating. And we can see that when we look at certain food combinations, whether it's refined carbohydrates and certain fats, that they do have the similar neural effects on the brain, on the striatum of the brain, as alcohol and tobacco. So could we be calling certain foods recreational drugs? Could we? I think there's a case, because a lot of the food we're eating is not for nutrition, it is mostly for entertainment, for pleasure, for escapism. And this may trigger a lot of people because we've normalized it. We've normalized unhealthy eating. Approximately 70% of the global diet is carbohydrate. yes, fiber is important, but there's also the protein leverage hypothesis, which tells us that we should really be focusing our diets around foods that satiate us. And the protein leverage hypothesis tells us that unless we get our protein requirements met, we will still consume until we are satiated. And that's interesting because it is very clear that a lot of us are not eating enough quality protein sources, whether that be plant-based or whether it be animal-based. So I think it's really important that we do acknowledge where we are in a modern world. And, you know, it's very clear. You've seen this 2022 systematic review showing us that, you know, type 2 diabetes is rampant here in Malaysia. But it's not just here in Malaysia, it's in the UK, it's in the Middle East where I was before this as well. But here in particular, you know, a kind of a 68% rise from 2011 to 2019, that is really significant. And here we are 2025 where it's expected that 7 million people are type 2 diabetic with a significant amount of undiagnosed type 2 diabetes as well. So enough of the doom and gloom. Underlying most of the chronic disease is insulin resistance. We heard it earlier on. Once the body starts to become resistant to the signal of the insulin because of things such as chronic excess energy consumption, you know, lack of sleep, high stress levels, environmental toxins, we get not just a resistance, but we get that double-edged sword, which is hyperinsulinemia as well. So excessive insulin floating around the body, which causes a lot of problems. And when the cells of the liver, the muscles, and the fat ultimately become resistant, you know, this is when the trouble starts. But if we go right to the root cause of a lot of chronic disease, it starts with insulin resistance. This insidious kind of situation where you don't actually know it's happening. It can be going on for months and years. And I think it's really important, as the last speaker said, that we should be testing for levels of, you know, kind of fasting insulin, as opposed to just looking at HbA1cs and fasting blood glucose. Because the, hyperinsulinemia can be happening for months, if not years, before we detect anything going on with fasting blood glucose. And there are a number of causative factors, and as the last speaker said again, these are all modifiable and they're all free. We can change our behaviours towards our food. We can change our sleep. We can, and it's easier said than done, but ultimately, lifestyle medicine really is now the front line, and it should be the foundation of our offerings and our services to our patients and clients. And so this is where, the research shows as well that lifestyle medicine, whether it's, the remission, the prevention, risk factor control, and the cost effectiveness, that now it should be front and center. And in the UK especially, there's a real kind of a rising surge of what we call social prescribing, where doctors are allied with the community, where they're actually prescribing community-based activities for their patients to get out there and actually take control, because it is difficult for us to just say, you should be doing more exercise or you should be eating healthier. But we need to get people out into the community where there are kind of structures and modalities and interventions for people to take on. And that's where I started the Metabolic Health Reset, because I thought to myself, as an osteopath in a clinic, I had so much effect. I saw patients for 35, 40 minutes at a time, but ultimately I wasn't able to provide the consistency and the structure that my patients needed for their self-care. And so I stepped away from clinic and I went into the community, and that's how I created the Metabolic Health Reset, which was basically just 5 pillars of, kind of what I would call fundamental self-care: nutrition, exercise, recovery, stress resilience, and mindset. And, being able to distill the science into very practical and pragmatic take-home interventions, it was quite a challenge, but it was all about testing and adjusting. And I started this in the Channel Islands in the UK, which are a small set of islands, about 60,000 people on one island, but very community-based, so it was very easy to work with hubs of people. And the results were quite fantastic when I started doing this. And with the first kind of modality I really wanted to focus on was the mindset, because I believe that getting people engaged with lifestyle medicine is really a mindset kind of challenge. And the great words of Henry Ford, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. And a lot of people feel as though they are helpless. They feel as though they have low self-efficacy. They don't feel as though they're empowered enough to be able to go out and practice a lot of these very simple behavioural modifications. And I think it's important for us as gatekeepers of healthcare to be able to empower our patients and say, well, actually, you can. And so I start by aligning values and trying to instill or trying to kind of cultivate intrinsic motivation, which I think is very important for anybody trying to change their lifestyle in the light of an environment that is really challenging you to be healthy. So, starting with very simple modalities, what are the macros that people, what's the nutrition that people need to be focusing on? And, you don't see carbohydrate there. Well, you do, you see some bread. Sorry, I should have put that in. But what we've got there are what I would regard are the most important macronutrients for not just for satiety, but for nutrition and health. And so, as mentioned earlier, building a diet around protein because it's so satiating, because it helps to preserve lean tissue, and also, healthy fats as well. We demonize fats a lot, and to be honest, the kind of vegetable fats and oils that people are using in the cheap foods that we're getting from the restaurants and the takeaways, they're also playing a big role in our demise, in our health demise. So I think it's important that, satiating ourselves with fiber, healthy fats and protein is a priority, keeping it very simple. I personally believe that carbohydrates, we can do away with a lot of the carbohydrates that we're consuming. And as I mentioned earlier, about 70% of the diet, especially in Asia, is based around carbohydrate, whether it's wheat or rice. And I mentioned earlier the protein leverage hypothesis. And it's really important that we are meeting our protein requirements, whether we're training or we're not training. And if we are resistance training, it is really important that we're getting, at least 1.6 grams to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And also ensuring that the first meal of the day is really, protein heavy. So the way we start our day is really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But also recognizing the difference between processed, unprocessed, and ultra-processed food. Because a lot of us are eating foods that they wouldn't be present in nature. They simply wouldn't be, and a lot of the time they're not recognizable to the body. So they've had the fiber stripped away from them, they've had a lot of the nutrients stripped away from them, yet we're eating them and we're wondering why we're not satiated. And so, this is just a little example of the difference between an unprocessed, processed, and ultra-processed food. And processed isn't so bad because a lot of, it might be just apples that have been sliced. It might be oil that's been extracted from a coconut. But it's when it becomes ultra-processed, when it's just a remnant of food, but it's actually got lots of preservatives, additives, flavorings, and it's designed to give you maximum, kind of flavor, but minimal satiety. And so the food industry uses terms such as craveability, bliss point, to keep us wanting these foods, but not necessarily being satiated. So it's important that we're focusing on helping people choose minimally processed or whole foods where possible. And these are very simple take-homes. I think it's really important that we can impart this information and say, well, prioritize protein, kind of fill up on fats, kind of minimize carbohydrates. I don't think that is a bad piece of advice. And also the first meal of the day. A lot of people will argue about whether the breakfast is a really important meal. But, if you keep it in the context of breaking the fast, it could be the first meal, whether it's 9 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think ultimately that meal will definitely influence the food that we eat thereon throughout the day, the amount of calories we eat thereon throughout the day. So I think it's really important that we see the first meal of the day as a kind of a startup and an influence for how the day will pan out nutritionally. So I definitely believe that we should be focusing on a protein-rich first meal of the day. Whether that's yogurt, eggs, nuts, seeds. We can get a first meal that will satiate us, help us produce our own levels of GLP, help us release the satiety hormones that really kind of they keep our blood sugar kind of steady, so we're not reaching for quick carbs because we're getting sugar highs and sugar lows. So the first meal of the day for me is really important. Also, eating in the morning I think is important because we have a circadian rhythm of insulin sensitivity. And we're more insulin sensitive in the morning than we are in the evening. So one meal, or the same meal eaten in the morning, will have a different effect on our blood glucose as it will in the evening. So I think it's important that we are, kind of judicious about how we tell our patients to eat, when we tell our patients to eat, and what we tell our patients to eat. And fasting was mentioned earlier, and I believe that from a circadian standpoint, we should be eating within a certain time window. The research is clear, whether it's the 5-2, whether it's intermittent fasting, or whether it's actually just time-restricted feeding. It's really important that we are trying to eat our meals within a certain time, and trying to kind of, front-load our food as opposed to eating later in the day, where we are becoming a little bit more insulin resistant. And this all lends itself to becoming more metabolically flexible. Our ability to use fat as a fuel instead of always focusing on using glucose. But when the body is more metabolically flexible, we are able to kind of tap into our fat stores better, which means that we are able to utilize the stored energy. We are able to, produce ketones, which are a fantastic source of fuel for the body and for the brain. We are able to keep inflammation levels low because we're more metabolically flexible. We're able to simply, switch between using fuel sources when the demand is needed. But when we're constantly chronically overeating and consuming excess energy, we're kind of stuck in glucose burning mode. I think that is important. And one of the parts of the program that we focus on is doing intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. And using supplements such as medium-chain triglycerides, which are a fantastic way of getting quick energy, feeding the brain, increasing circulating levels of ketones, and helping people kind of transition through periods of calorie restriction without the discomfort that often may come along if you're not used to that. So actually helping people, use fat as a fuel as opposed to, kind of having the highs and lows of blood sugar dips and using, readily available carbohydrates. And if we use the analogy of a hybrid car, ultimately we are, we can use electricity or we can use petrol. And I think at high intensity, if you're a performance athlete, yes, we need carbohydrate, we need glucose. But for most of us who are living a normal everyday life, we would be quite happy using our fat stores as energy if we were better at tapping into them. So using electricity as opposed to using petrol. So for me, I think it's really important that we train our bodies to become more metabolically flexible through the use of time-restricted feeding and macronutrient distribution. And for anybody that kind of worries about fasting in any way, shape or form, just an interesting point, the longest fast on record, 382 days by a man called Angus Barbary, who had nothing but carbonated water, tea, coffee, and vitamins and minerals for 382 days. He lost about 20 stone, and he lived a healthy life. So fasting is something that is, it's inherent within our DNA. As I said earlier, we've spent the majority of our time living in environments of scarcity, where we would spend time, days, if not weeks, with minimal energy sources. And so therefore, that's why we are very capable of storing energy. So, we shouldn't be afraid of restricting calories because it is a kind of definitely a highway to better health. And as Dr. Aisha mentioned earlier, muscle, definitely the organ of longevity. Whether it is protecting against cancer, inflammation, and increasing insulin sensitivity. I think about 80% of the glucose that we ingest is stored within our muscles. So if we have a low muscle mass, then that is an impediment to our metabolic health, because what do we do with all of that glucose? We end up with hyperinsulinemia, we end up with more visceral fat, we end up with more inflammation and ultimately downstream things like cardiovascular disease. So, just simply giving people very, very basic modalities in resistance training, cardiovascular training, getting people a little bit more active, whether it's calisthenics or in a gym, it's not rocket science, and I think ultimately we can translate some of these modalities to our patients with very little time or effort. And another aspect of the metabolic health reset is getting people to, align with their natural circadian rhythms. So getting people doing certain activities at certain times, because naturally our bodies are designed we have these, within every cell of the body we have a 24-hour kind of light-dark clock timer or zeitgeber. And it's really important that we are trying to align our body's optimal rhythms with the activities and behaviors that we are interacting with. And so this is another aspect of the metabolic health reset. And resilience to stress. It's a huge one, and I think this is probably one of the hardest things to really get across and to help people ameliorate or reduce, is to kind of get them first of all to perceive stress differently, because a lot of us are living in environments where we are constantly stimulated, overstimulated and distracted, and we have a natural kind of cortisol rhythm, a circadian rhythm. And we can use this to our advantage, whether it's with exercise, whether it's ingesting caffeine and coffee, and whether it's, kind of when we should be going to bed. But ultimately, I think it's important that we align with our natural bodily rhythms, whether it's for insulin, whether it's for cortisol, and whether it's for any behavior. Because as I said earlier, we have been aligned with nature's light-dark cycles for nearly 300,000 years. And when it comes to stress, it's really about perception. I try to help people take a top-down, kind of perspective on stress. Is it a challenge or a threat? Are you excited or are you anxious? Because a lot of the same impact, the same kind of physiological consequences, they could be perceived as either a threat or a challenge. And I think it's important that we stigmatize a lot of the things that happen in our life as stressful in a negative sense, when actually, we've invited those things into our life. So it's not really about kind of, putting a negative slant on stress. It's really about seeing things differently, so that when we are faced with certain, kind of challenges, that we're not really just taking a negative slant on them. Now, sleep hygiene. Ultimately, if there's one thing that is the foundation of health, the pillars that sit on top, our sleep and our rest and our recovery, because like with resistance training, building muscle, it's not in the gym that we build muscle, it's when we recover, it's when we actually, kind of rest and we sleep and we recover. And so helping people develop a morning routine and an evening routine, I think is very important, because a good night's sleep starts in the morning when we wake up. And so, these are very simple take-homes that I think we could all impart. And in a matter of 6 weeks, I did a recent kind of case study, and it was over 6 weeks. And over a very small period of time, we had some very kind of significant results. Whether it's fasting insulin levels, whether it's HbA1c levels, whether it's waist circumference. We had about 16 participants. And of course, there wasn't a full kind of adherence rate, but for the people that followed the principles, there was some significant results. And this is only in a 6-week period. So really, lifestyle medicine, whether it's resistance training, whether it's nutritional kind of modification, whether it's sleep hygiene, these are the first line kind of modalities that we should be using with our patients. And I always say to people that the power of community is far greater than any clinic, hospital, or physician to create health. And the one thing that I have kind of put myself into position with is working at the coalface with the community, as opposed to sitting in my ivory tower and being time restricted. I like to get out there and actually be a leader. And I think what Aisha said earlier is so critical, that we are leading from the front. We're not just people who kind of sit there and impart information, because the Latin root of the word doctor is docere, which means to teach. And I think teaching is not just by words, but it's by example. And I think by getting out there and being an example of what we want our patients to actually aspire to is really important. There was a little video there. Is it not going to come up? No problem if not. Don't worry. I've already run out of time. But my emphasis and my plea, my rally cry is, let's have more collaboration and less compartmentalization within medicine, within healthcare. Because ultimately, like I said, in the UK, and in Singapore as well, this concept of social prescribing where doctors, physicians are collaborating with community-based, whether it's gyms, cooking classes, yoga classes, and they're prescribing to their patients to get out into these communities and into these interventions where they can be embedded within a community, within a structure, and they can make meaningful change, rather than just saying to them, you know, you should eat a healthy diet and you should do a little bit of exercise. And that takes collaboration between healthcare practitioners and people out in the community, such as health coaches, functional medicine doctors, personal trainers. You know, we are as important as the conventional gatekeepers of health in a modern day landscape where most of the diseases are lifestyle related and modifiable. So I think what we need is definitely more collaboration. The Metabolic Health Reset is a brilliant program to be able to be used as an adjunct to any clinical practice because it is simple, it is practical, and it is based on principles, not prescriptions. And so what we don't do is tell people what to do. We give people the evidence-based principles, and they choose their route to get to that principle. So it is personalised in that sense. One person might be doing something completely different to another to get to said principle and get the results they want. And so if anybody wants to, know more about the Metabolic Health Reset, then please scan the QR, give me a shout, and I'll be more than happy to share my program with you. But ultimately, guys, I think the emphasis here is that we're trying to be disruptive, right? And to be disruptive means, in some sense, to go against the grain. And in a conventional healthcare setting where people are maybe time poor, they're incentivized in a way that doesn't necessarily cultivate root cause solutions, we maybe need to step out a little bit and think, well, okay, how can I augment my practice to regain trust? Because trust in primary healthcare has definitely been compromised, especially since COVID. And I think we need to rebuild trust with patients and clients. And also health literacy. How do we communicate these simple modalities with our patients? How do we get them applying these practical principles so that they make meaningful change? Because when we win trust, we win retention. When we win retention, then everybody wins. It's a win-win. So thank you very much for listening. And I do appreciate your time, and thank you guys for helping out.
Thank you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, give a big round of applause to Mr. Ricky Brown. And now those of you all who
stress eats a lot. How would you advise someone who stress eats a lot?
Stress
It's
eats.
good stress, they're having good stress, I think, but they just stress eat. I mean, I'm talking about myself, of course.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, we're using food just as much for escapism and entertainment as we are for nourishment. And actually your awareness of that is your first weapon. So being aware of that. Now, there are a number of modalities that we can use to ameliorate stress. And it's the connections and the associations that we create for relief. And stress, it's not stress itself that causes problems, it's our responses to stress. Whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, food. And so it's really about can I actually, first of all, recognize and sit with this emotion, this feeling, knowing that it's going to subside. And even if you give yourself a minute and just a number of seconds before you actually go from the thought to the action, it's enough to dilute that desire. And often, eating is an impulsive response that we do almost instantaneously to get to reduce the intensity of that feeling or the perceived feeling. So a lot of the time it's just about giving yourself a little bit of space. And I don't know whether you've ever read the book Man's Search for Meaning. And there's a great saying in that, is that in between the thought and the action there is a space. And in that space, that is where change occurs. So it's about creating enough space between the feeling that you have when you're stressed and the impulse of and taking the action. And so there are lots of modalities, whether it is EFT, whether it is breath work, whether it is simply just going for a walk, taking a glass of water, because sometimes all we need to do is stretch the receptors in our stomach to get a sense of relief. Yes, there are certain foods that help to release dopamine, and we know that, and that's why food addiction is a very real kind of burden at the moment. But there are other ways of releasing dopamine. Whether it is exercise, whether it is some breath work, whether it is actually getting around people, because the stress response, there's a tend and befriend response. It's not just fight or flight. Tend and befriend could be a phone call. It could be calling somebody, being around a group of people. But we must start by being proactive and trying to break that association. Because yes, food is always going to be there as some form of escapism and therapy, but ultimately the insidious impact of that down the line is, it's kind of like we're using our credit card to buy things for the instant, knowing that we're not putting anything in the savings account and we're going to suffer later on. So I think it's really about how can we just sit in that emotion, create enough time for that just to dissipate, and then choose a different response, which is easier said than done, but it can be done.
Nice. We got one more from the floor. Fantastic. Here you go.
Thank you, Ricky, for sharing with us. Well, this is something that is very common in the Asian space. Okay, when somebody's on a program that we put them on, say we have 6 to 8 weeks, and festivity happens, you cannot say no to food. How do you get that client or patient that is on your program to stick to your program when they have to go through this traumatic experience of being with family and food? Sorry, I use it trauma because I have to deal with all the excuses that
No, it's absolutely fine because, luckily I've had the pleasure and privilege of working in various different cultures. I was in the Middle East before here, in Qatar and Dubai, and it's very similar. Culturally, food plays a massive role. It's so integral to, social life, business, entertainment. Food is so intertwined, and it is a difficult thing to untangle. But first of all, it's about prioritizing your health and saying, well, what does it mean to me as an individual? We often have to let people down. We often have to, disagree with people. We often have to do things that might be a little bit in conflict with the environment around us, and I'm sure we do that on a daily basis. But when it comes to food, you're not only dealing with the perceived pressure of relatives and the environment, but also the enjoyment of the food. Because 1 won't hurt, 2's okay, 3 nobody's worrying. But at the end of the day, it's really about you saying to yourself, who is the person that I want to be? If you're somebody who's trying to lose weight, trying to reduce your HbA1c, trying to reverse type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, it's about saying, well, who is the person in the future? What is that person saying in this situation? And what I found is that people who do consistently kind of honour that, and they say, well, okay, thank you, but no thank you, eventually they become the lighthouses within that environment, and then people start to look at them and think, well, it's working for you, maybe I should try that. So it's about being somebody who's a trailblazer, and somebody who's, kind of in line enough with their own values and their own kind of future goals to be able to say, thank you, but no thank you. And we know the first one's always the best, right? The first one is always the best, and then it's diminishing returns. So have one. Can you control it? Because that's the issue in today's world. It's about control. We can all watch a Netflix series, but we want to watch 3. We can all have 1 coffee, but we want to have 4. We can all have 1, French fry or potato chip, but we'll have the whole packet. Because our environment is addictogenic. It's designed to do that to us and play on our primal instincts. So it's really about you saying to yourself, who is the person that I want to be, and what is that person saying in this scenario? And so if you are somebody who can moderate yourself, excellent. If you're not, don't put yourself in those environments too often.
Okay, so basically don't have family function later. That's what he's saying.
All right, everybody loves their food, right? We all love our food. It's not just Malaysians, it's not just, everybody does. We're all struggling with it. But we all have that ability to either instantly gratify or say to ourselves, is this good for me long term? Is this setting a pattern that I will have to break or find it harder to break in the future? So I think it's really about bringing awareness to our choices and decisions.
Yeah. We have a question right here on the screen. I think we'll go with the bottom and then going up. It's coming from someone who is obviously very stressed. and chronically fatigued. They want 5 best advices you can give.
Chronically stressed and fatigued. Okay, so first of all, if you're chronically fatigued, I would say maybe go for a blood test. First of all,
That's a good one.
So check out your.
I'm looking at the audience and see who's dozing off, and then I can
check out your fasting insulin levels, your fasting glucose, your HbA1c. Check out your liver enzymes. Check out your inflammatory markers and your lipids, and see if there is any underlying imbalances from a metabolic perspective. Because often when people are fatigued, there is a dysregulation, especially in blood glucose and energy levels. But then maybe you might be a perimenopausal woman, so it might not be anything to do with your, well, not necessarily your metabolic health. So it depends on the context of the fatigue. But if stress and fatigue are kind of playing in together, then again, it's really about looking at stressors and saying, well, okay, could I use an adaptogen herb? Could I moderate any of my lifestyle modalities? Am I pushing too hard in certain areas? Could I introduce exercise to actually improve my mitochondrial health? Could I take a supplement such as creatine? There's lots of, kind of modalities that people can choose, but I think underneath it all is, from a top-down perspective, how are we perceiving what is stressing us? Are we having a negative connotation in the light of something that is maybe something that we have invited into our lives, something that we can handle, something that we can change ourselves? Because really it's about modifying what is causing stress, whether it's our perception or whether it's the actual activity. And then I think, all of these things are like a domino effect. When we knock one over, other things start to fall into line as well. So less stress, maybe better sleep, maybe less fatigue. So the best 5 advices, I would say: blood test, exercise, I would say zone 2 cardio, 40 to 65% of your, 40 to 65% of your heart rate, brisk walk every day, you can hold a conversation, 30 minutes at least, get your mitochondria working, get more oxygen in your brain. Food, reduce unnecessary refined carbohydrates. Supplementation, maybe think of a adaptogen herb, something like a rhodiola rosea, which is going to give you energy and also help reduce stress. And maybe something like creatine. I think creatine is one of the most underrated supplements for recovery and energy, and I think that it's the most clinically studied supplement out there, whether it's for men and women. I think it's fantastic. So that would be my 5.
Nice. We'll go on to a final question before we end this session. The last one, any recommended wearables? I think wearables to, track your heart rate and stuff like that.
Where's this?
Right at the bottom of the last line.
Wearables.
Yeah.
Okay. So wearables, I think at the moment a continuous glucose monitor is the new heart rate monitor. I think people in an environment where metabolic dysfunction is increasing, I think it's really important for us, for behavior modification and for our own information, to be able to put something on and be able to see how we're responding to stress, sleep, nutrition, even hydration. And a continuous glucose monitor is a fantastic way to get instant feedback. It's not an accurate reading, but it gives us patterns. It helps us to see whether certain things are causing excessive blood glucose dips and spikes. So I think CGM. I also think heart rate variability, which you can get on an app on the phone. So timing the intervals between each heartbeat is very indicative of your levels of readiness for intense physical activity, how stressed you are, how well you're recovering, doing that at the same time every morning. So I'd say heart rate variability and continuous glucose monitors, I think, are very relevant in today's.
Yeah, there are a lot of new devices now in the market, from rings to for watches and even your phone as well. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please a big round of applause for Mr. Ricky right over here. Thank you so much, sir.